Hello, everybody, and welcome to Theory Plebes Valentine's Day special. Today we are joined by Emily Pothast to talk about sex, love, and fascism. I go by Neighbor Lisa. This podcast is about critical theory and philosophy. This is also going out on a live stream for patrons and any of the randos who might be walking on by. I guess they could also pop in, because who doesn't want to hear about sex, love, and fascism when Valentine's Day is coming up? Emily is an artist, critic, and historian, and we can talk a little bit more about how we met and how this kind of conversation got started in the first place. But first, I thought I'd turn it over to you so you can talk a little bit about the work and research that you've been up to.
Sure. Well, my research project that I've been working on sort of long term has to do with early print culture in Germany. So the first 100 years or so of the printing press, and apocalypticism. So illustrations of the apocalypse become very important in the sort of first viral age. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of them are theological, but a lot of them are sort of socio-political and have to do with affect and, you know, getting people worked up about something. One thing that really appeals to me about the Book of Revelation, I don't know, a lot of people who grew up in like religious households know this already, what the theologian Stephen D. Moore says, that it's a border document that polices the boundary between the clean and the unclean, the sinner and the sinful and the saved, So that sort of, I'm interested in that border document function of these images because it really, it sort of conjures a space in which there's a cohesive us versus them. And, these images kind of get called on over and over again throughout like German history. And German identity is really just coming into being in, this is like the Holy Roman Empire during the 15th and 16th century. So the idea of German identity would later sort of call on Martin Luther and call on this time period as sort of very formative. And so my research kind of deals with the stuff from 500 years ago mostly, but obviously being on the internet as much as we are and thinking about these things, I think about how those currents come through to the present day. So I gave a talk about 2 weeks ago at an art school where I lecture here in Seattle called The Aesthetics of Fascism. And, I'm kind of looking at a lot of the currents that are present in the artwork of the Third Reich and also like Mussolini's Italy, both of which sort of in different ways imagine this mythic past, this sort of, virile Greco-Roman cult of the body, cult of youth, cult of masculinity. And, you can still see today in Rome, the figures that were built for Mussolini's Foro Italico, which was supposed to house the Olympics. There's a lot of sexuality just comes up over and over again. And so when we started talking about a Valentine's Day conversation, and you and I decided to kind of talk through some of the currents that you and I kind of talk about on the phone sometimes about the sort of sexual dynamics of fascism. And so I think just to begin with, it helps for us to both get on the same page and maybe on the same page with people who are listening about what we mean by fascism. Yes. So do you have a definition that you enjoy?
I really enjoy this one definition. No, cool. There are, several aspects of it that, necessary and sufficient conditions, I guess, that, you could say. Like for some people, it has to involve anti-Semitism. The way that I use it is a little bit looser than that, because it's more of like this rigid hierarchical us versus they, us being at the top of the hierarchy, they being lower. And that's either naturalized and justified through genetics or racism or just like, oh, those cultures are inferior or just, it's not us. And at the end of the day, we have to put ourselves first at other people's expense. And so it's kind of like nationalism on crack, you know, and so it'll use various means to do that, but usually racism, right?
Yeah, for sure. So some of the points, and there's a whole definitions of fascism Wikipedia article that goes into all the differences. Like you said, some people think it has to, it's anti-Semitism. I think there's sort of a lot of different things that get called fascism. Sometimes, people call feminists fascist on college campuses is that fascism. And I think that the sort of what you've already mentioned, there's definitely an us versus them, which I think implies a strong construction of us. The idea, the bundle, the fasces is the stick that is stronger when all of the individuals come together. So there's sort of something that happens with the creation of a collective identity that sort of overrides the individual, but also gives us a chance to participate in something that's, thicker, stronger, heavier than what we are, and wield it as a weapon if need be. So I think that sort of social construction of an identity that is collective is really inherent in most definitions of fascism. A lot of definitions of fascism will also say that it's like inherently, it's inherently authoritarian, but also inherently right wing. And I think that is something that's also a little contentious because, there are folks from Wilhelm Reich writing about the sexuality underlying fascism in the sort of post-war period, to Jürgen Habermas, who also thinks there's sort of a left fascist construction. And I think that's something that you need to kind of define when you're going forward, like how important is the actual economic system to is this fascist or not,
Well, I left off one important element that has to be put in there. It's like, because fascist is kind of under the umbrella of reactionary, and reactionary, you could also just be more of a conservative, but still anti-authoritarian, anti-rigid hierarchy, blah, 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 but still have those kind of more conservative values where it's basically, but the reactionary kind of umbrella is this nostalgizing the past, romanticizing the past, saying we've fallen from some higher, more cohesive state, and that's something that we have to return to, and then by force usually is kind of the next step. And then usually like, oh, why did we fall from it? Well, it was the fault of X, Y, or Z people, right?
And I think in general those nostalgias are very false or fabricated. There's an idea, and one example that I use in my Aesthetics of Fascism talk is that there's this idea in sort of Greco-Roman sculpture. Obviously, Romans took a lot of design and sculpture ideas from Greeks. And there's this idea in the Renaissance that these marbles were white and devoid of color. And so the idea of a classical nude that Renaissance artists would replicate that looks to Greece and Rome of being like a white marble sculpture isn't true. A lot of these sculptures had paint originally, and some of the paint flaked off through the years. There were some cases where art historians actually removed paint from sculptures that were found because museums wanted them to look classical. So the idea that classical look is devoid of color is almost just like, it's like literally a whitewashing of history. So when we look at those images and we have this Greco-Roman or even like vaporwave Greco-Roman, busts that insert themselves in the internet. It's a false image of, it's something that didn't really exist to begin with, except as a memory of something that we imagine after the fact. So, and I think that's sort of also, if you think about like the Garden of Eden as like a state of perfection, like that story itself has like, there's a lot of politics that are specific to its time and place in that story that get lost in retellings. And, depending on who we are, we might be romanticizing something that isn't really there. And I think that's definitely something that when I think about fascism, is there's a romanticization of something that isn't there. The idea that a strictly, rigidly defined gender binary is something that is classical and traditional and, belongs to this sort of Ur period of the ideals that we're going to return to is also not borne out by history, of course. There's all kinds of gender systems in indigenous cultures and traditional cultures all over the world, we can in fact trace the origins of the rigidly defined gender binary to agriculture, state building, making the state a machine to make population. So that sort of need to have the bodies that give birth in the service of the state is something that has a historical origin point and a historical story. So imagining that it's something that is like natural. Like, what does natural mean? I mean, natural changes based on what nature changes. So natural changes depending on where we are in the linear time that folds up on itself, and
Right. Yeah, and I think, did you see the most recent Philosophy Tube video? It was the one that's on Steve Bannon.
I haven't seen it, unfortunately, or fortunately, probably because Bannon.
It's amazing. So, I think it's maybe the best video that Ollie has put out. And when one of my friends saw it on Facebook, she said that she thinks it's probably the most effective piece of anti-fascist information that's been produced on YouTube.
Oh, wow.
in the last decade. It's good, yeah. And one of the things that he uses is a clip of the Golden One having a conversation.
Oh, that guy.
Yeah, that dude. The living meme.
If you're like on YouTube, you're gonna edit to Golden One.
Surprise flex. Yeah. Anyway, but he's in a conversation with this other person, and they're talking, and they address this question of like, how do you make sure that you're going back to the right traditions? Right? Like, his traditions change. And so how do you pick which ones you're going back to? And then he basically, now I'm not going to quote it exactly right now, but he basically says, and I don't think he realizes that he even says this, is that you take your current values, right? And it's like, but he doesn't really realize what he said, and Ollie kind of brings that to the fore. But it's like, that's exactly right. That's exactly what is being done, is like, you take your current values that are politicized. They're political historical constructs that are relevant now, but then you go cherry picking through history and you find things that can kind of fit and kind of back that up, and then you stitch together this straw man of what used to be that you want to romanticize.
It's like a Pinterest mood board, all right? It's like your mood board. Like, I want to be this. I want to look like the Apollo Belvedere, Belvedere. Like, I want to look like Michelangelo's David. Like, this is my mood board. And that book I was just talking about, Stephen D. Moore, which Untold Tales from the Book of Revelation. It's a wonderful little collection of essays. Moore is a constructive theologian, a contemporary theologian who thinks very critically and sort of postmodern about the Bible and so forth. And it's a great book about sort of empire and ecology and sexuality going through Revelation. But there's this essay about bodybuilding and hypermasculinity and the throne room scene in Revelation. So there's this, this mirrored room of this body that's on the throne, and it's just these angels that are singing, basically, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, for all eternity. And he sort of compares it to like the reveal of a bodybuilder reality show. And it's a wonderful contextualization for that myth, because what's happening in Revelation is this sort of Roman cult of the emperor there's a sort of like apotheosis of that, where the structure of the cult of empire is being placed in the heavens. And that has different, implications. If you're Rome, then you're going to want to own that myth so that you can then impose your emperor cult all over the whole world. But if you're trying to rebel against Rome or reject Rome, then, you want to create your own authority that has authority over Rome. So that kind of construction is interesting, because that tool, that weaponized narrative, can work both as a tool of oppression and a tool of resistance. And I think originally John of Patmos sees himself as resisting the Roman Empire, obviously, or like very thin but obvious references to Rome throughout that text. And, when it gets taken up by, Martin Luther or whoever, it's usually there's like someone it's against. Either it's Rome and Catholicism and the Protestant Reformation, or it's everyone who isn't a Southern Baptist. I grew up I spent a lot of time in Wichita Falls, Texas. So it was feminists and all the people that, Pat Buchanan, or what is his name? Pat Robertson. I get those two people confused. That's their names. 700 Club guy, right? That's Pat Robertson. Not the paleo conservative who wouldn't stop running for president. Pat Robertson saying that 9/11 was caused by abortions or something. That guy. Christians keep using this text over and over again to point it in different directions. But like what it really does is it takes the structure of the emperor cult of Rome and puts it in the heavens. And it is a hot bod with angels going, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And so it's sort of there's a proto-fascist aesthetic to that adoration of the masculine power that's in that throne room. And, I think that's something that comes through, there's a lot of apocalypticism in Nazi ideology, obviously. So, but so yeah, in the just in terms of like sexuality, there's a couple of sculptors in Nazi Germany, and I'm just gonna pull up. I'll send you some links actually. So when this is on YouTube,
you can screen share too. Yeah.
Yeah. So one is Josef Thorak and one is Arno Breker. These are the official sculptors of the Third Reich. And I'd have to pull up my lecture to actually get the slides, but I'll send you some and you can put them in there because they're super homoerotic. they're super homoerotic and they're super chiseled. They're literally chiseled because they're sculptures, but they're these bodies that are larger than life, more masculine, more hyper masculine than is possible. And I think that that's a really interesting place to segue into where sexuality sort of kind of meets.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to ask. Yeah, because hypermasculinity, I don't naturally equate hypermasculinity. I mean, yes, I do equate hypermasculinity with homoeroticism, but I do not necessarily equate it with fascism, right? So the only way that I, just from a bystander point see that is that fascism often is like we need a strong dad, we need a strong dad to clean the house of the rabble, but right. Yeah, but I mean, you could have a strong monarchy that's not really fascist, right? I'm not really sure. So how would you?
Maybe. I mean, I think Wilhelm Reich in his mass psychology of fascism does talk about the family dynamics of, that being sort of a place where that structure of a strong daddy replicates itself. And his case, I mean, part of it can be boiled down to the idea that the sexual repression, he argues that fascism or that Nazism specifically happened in Germany because of the way that German children, were sexually repressed. He's like, I can tell you how sexual repression happened. And so, it's don't touch that. That's dirty. Don't do that. Don't. All the things that Freud was concerned about during the genital phase, children's sort of natural innate curiosity being squashed by society telling children not to be sexual. Reich argues that this kind of creates a situation where people will learn to respond to that kind of suppression and if you give them an outlet, they'll take that outlet. If that outlet is hierarchical authoritarian power structure, so that sort of that image of all of the men together on the battlefield, all the Spartans doing their exercises together, that identity that supersedes the individual has an erotic component to it. You wouldn't necessarily even think of it as homoerotic if you're not thinking that way, but it's definitely a place where sexuality is allowed to flourish without women. The problem is women, right? Women are a problem. They're trouble. Eve is tempted by the serpent. Women are. If your goal is to create a very hierarchical organized system where everything runs predictably and you can control it, you have to figure out how to control women. And learning how to and figuring out how to control women is complicated. We have to, make birth control, abortion. We have to have witch hunts if women are starting to have too much power or be able to survive without men. You have to take away their property rights. Caliban and the Witch, Federici talks a lot about this. So a lot of the sort of implementation of hypermasculinity is this sort of patriarchal suppression of women's rights. But I think more importantly is the way there's a freedom from the gaze that's really what's going on here.
Gaze, Gaze.
Yeah, a freedom from women seeing what you're doing. Not if you exclude women from a space, or you don't have, women don't have a say in a social sphere, not allowed to vote, not allowed to appear in public, for instance. You get to control a lot of narratives. I mean, I feel like Me Too is a pushing back against the suppression of what women are allowed to say in different spaces. It's if you let women say whatever they want, they might be like, I don't want to see your dick, and that's heartbreaking, who doesn't want to see my dick, but I think a lot about the myth of Medusa.
Speaking of Valentine's Day, man. No.
I know what I'm getting you for Valentine's. I thought about getting a box of chocolates and just eating them if we had an awkward pause. Medusa, there's so much going on in the myth of Medusa that is really instructive to the sort of psychology of Greece and Rome in the time that fascist aesthetics like to look back to, which is that Medusa is an African mother goddess. She's from Libya, Berber tribes. She gets sort of assimilated into Greek religion through her contact with, the Greeks. And she's raped in the temple of Athena by, I think, Poseidon, who she's looking really pretty. It's her fault, right? So she gets punished for her own rape by becoming a monster whose gaze turns men to stone. And there's this interesting essay from the 90s. I think the author's name's Susan Bowers, about sort of Medusa and the feminist gaze, but kind of making that argument that, if this person who is a goddess who belongs to these people that you've conquered and assimilated, and if she can see what you're doing and make eye contact with you and just go and point the finger and judge you and go, hey, knock it off, or even just I see you, that is existentially terrifying. And the terror of Medusa, Freud has an essay about Medusa too, about the sort of fear of castration. But I think the real fear is being seen and, being held accountable. Right. And so she's sort of a figurehead of these, there's these in the Basilica Cistern in Istanbul, they have these columns that were cut down out of Greek temple and repurposed. And they've taken, there was a column with Medusa on the top, and so the entire weight of the building is on her head, crushing her. And it's, superstitious because you're subverting her gaze, but it's also this, the whole weight coming down on her. There's this brutality. And there's a lot of brutality in sort of Roman sculpture from this time. I think of in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, there's a series of sculptures from the gate around Pergamon, which was a city in Asia Minor. And, you have a Roman soldier who's got a body like a god. He's in armor, and a woman who's in chains, and she's tiny and she's a slave. And it sort of shows you that relationship, not only of women to the Roman Empire, but also the people that we conquer. This is what we do. There's there's this othering that happens to the people who are conquered, where they're feminized and, made small. And that's part of part of like triumphing over them. And one more thing before we get out of ancient Rome is just the story about the rape of the Sabines, which is a very formative episode where like Romulus is founding the city. All his soldiers they need wives, and he's like asking the neighboring towns like, hey, can we have your daughters? And they were like, no. And so they threw a party and they got everyone drunk, and then they gave a signal and they fought off the men and took the daughters, and it's the abduction of the Sabines, or the rape of the Sabines. And this is like, there's great paintings by Rubens. There's all these, great paintings from the Renaissance of this subject. And also if you go to the Loggia in Florence, showing the power of the Medicis, there's this, there's Perseus and Medusa. He's beheaded her. And then right across from it is like the rape of the Sabine. So these are these two myths that are like Greece and Rome. These are the important myths that are foundational. And this is how the Medici see themselves. This is how they see themselves, like carrying that power into the future, is like, we conquer these people, we brutalize them. We take their gods, and then the gods become monsters, or, we take their women and the women become slaves. And so that sort of dynamic of that relationship, when we're fetishizing Western civilization, I mean, that's kind of implicit in what we're fetishizing. This is return to these values. It's like, okay, so when's the pillar going to come down through my head? Because this is what we do. This is what we do. But
or when prominent right leaning individuals are talking about how women are chaos and masculinity is order, and how the globalist postmodern neo-Marxist feminist forces are feminizing us all, and that's weakening our cultural cohesion and it's ruining our values. Yeah, the whole thing.
I gave a talk about Jordan Peterson, where he uses Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, to sort of say that, this is biology. Men are logical and rational. Women are, I have a Kermit the Frog I should get while I'm doing. It's like,
oh my God.
It's like, women are chaotic, but that it's here in this myth, and it's natural. Men are irrational, women are chaotic. It's here in this myth. It's natural, and there's nothing we can do about it. This is just biology. And of course, this is bullshit. This is because this myth has a historical context. It comes from a time when we can see from the Code of Hammurabi that they are trying to consolidate power and make the pantheon of Babylon supersede all the other pantheons. So there's this political power grab that's being justified by the gods. And that's something that happens a lot in these stories, is you have gods whose activities are sort of mirroring the reality that we live in the heavens. And, then you tell a story with the gods about what you want to be, and that doesn't mean, biologically, I guess we're all kinds of things, but biologically, we're not. Marduk and Tiamat are not best explained through biology. They are, it's a political story. Yeah.
Is this the talk that you did at JPCon?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that is the talk I did at JPCon. Yeah, no, but with Peterson, I think I always wonder why people don't ask him about his relationship with his mother. First off, because he's always talking about narcissistic women and narcissistic mothers, and it's like
Stefan on you.
Let's get in there. Let's get in there. Let's get under the hood. Your sweet, sweet hairless body, which apparently, I don't know if that's true, but that's what he looked like naked in my dream.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Completely like a Ken doll. So let's keep talking. I wish I had that box of chocolate.
I'm not gonna psychoanalyze this dream because I'm not qualified. But if I did, no, I'm just kidding. Well, there's a couple of things here. So we've started backwards in the list. We started with fascism, and then we kind of moved back to sex, which was the first in the list. We haven't gotten too much into that just yet. And then there is of course love. But I wanna just bring up really quick what kind of inspired the conversation in the first place. The reason I thought this would be a fun for Valentine's Day, beyond the obvious reasons, was like originally it's kind of started with a conversation about the psychodynamics of men who over-identify with all things masculine, or who haven't at least been very self-critical of how they might have internalized a lot of the assumptions about masculinity, will be around women who are showing signs of distress, distraught, anger, right? And there, we've had our reasons for this, beyond the fact that we met at a conference about Jordan Peterson, who's obviously an angry man who is distraught about angry women he thinks are distraught, and he's trying to bring back order to what he sees as feminine chaos. There's obviously just been a variety of examples in our culture and interpersonal experiences with people who seem to display this dynamic. But before we get into the dynamic, I just want to say really quick as well that one of the reasons it's so powerful for me is like, I realized, wow, this is me too. Like I also have experienced, like just you talking about it was like a wake up call for me to be like, wow, what are the ways that I've been playing into this also? So, yeah. What is that dynamic for you? Right. And how does that tie into all of this?
Well, I think there's a couple things. We were just talking about how difficult it is to tolerate the gaze of, that woman who is, maybe she has a reason to be upset. Maybe she's Medusa, and she has reasons to be upset, and she can see you, and it's paralyzing. That being a subject, we always talk about the sort of the male gaze in art and how, women are bodies and men are gazing upon women's bodies. But this doesn't explain all those like muscular men in the Roman sculptures at all. Those are men whose bodies we gaze upon, so that there, I think there's a horror and anxiety around being a subject, period. And I think that for women, and I'm being really essential, but people who are socialized in a feminine way, who like you walk down the street and get catcalled, you learn early on that you have to kind of take care and protect yourself because the world is full of like, cartoon wolves, wolf whistling at you, you're a piece of meat walking around. So like, you're going to get treated a certain kind of way. And so you learn about your subjecthood. You learn about the way that others see you and kind of perform for that in whatever way is adaptive. And I think that's something that it's possible to kind of get pretty far in life without really thinking through if you're not in a vulnerable body, like positionality wise in our culture. I think that there's the we talked a little bit about the sort of like breastfeeding infant and the sort of oxytocin that happens with the mother and or whoever like is a caregiver. When we're babies, we kind of learn early on that like there's everything you get from your environment, you're getting from this person, and it's usually like traditionally, if we're lucky and we have a mother, it's our mother. And when she's displeased with us, like that is the whole world, crashing down. I read something, I read something horrible about this experiment. What was it? The stone face? I think that's what it was called. I meant to take a note on it, but where they like actually did this thing with babies where they were like laughing and mirroring their laughter, and then all of a sudden they just stopped. And the babies are just like, and they would implode. And it sounds like a cruel thing to do, because if you stop mirroring that emotion, it's like, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? And right. So if we're moving through life and we're expecting, that everyone's performing, customer service, everyone's performing a big smile, we will get anxiety over displeasure. And I think that for various reasons, some possibly biological, a lot social, we really, really, really feel a lot of anxiety when we don't get smiles from women, you know? And I think that, you know, this is probably especially true for like heterosexual men. You want to make sure, you know, men are afraid women will laugh at them. You know, it's like you want to make sure that you're cool, you're impressive, like, you know, the women are genuinely smiling and enjoying your time. You know, women, a lot of women who perform sex work, a lot of the work is just kind of being there for someone and smiling and being like, you're okay, you know? And that is, you know, a lot of emotional labor. But what it comes down to too is the kind of vulnerability that we're left with when we realize that, you know, sometimes it's like somebody's just having a bad day and it's not your fault. Sometimes you've actually displeased someone, and that's something that we need to contend with. And learning how to deal with that emotional difficulty of having displeased someone is something, you know, it's possible for privileged people in our culture to move through the world without ever having to deal with that. You can just sweep over that mess. She's not important. You know, there was, you know, 60 women before like Bill Cosby, you know, it's like got held accountable, because it's very easy if there's a lot of young women and they want to be actresses or they want to do this or that, it's very easy to sweep them aside and they don't matter. And you can just kind of, I also recently watched the Fox News Roger Ailes documentary, and it seems like every woman who ever worked for Fox News was like, you know, that made their career, how they reacted when he made a pass at them, you know, or destroyed their career. And you know, it's like they're disposable. Like they're just, you don't have to contend or deal with that. So if you get into a situation where all of a sudden you do have to contend or deal with that, the way the culture has changed around Me Too, it like kind of puts people in a really defensive position that they've never really had to deal with, I think, sometimes. You know, either you can kind of try to retreat the same way that men have always retreated, but it kind of like, it's a bad look. Like the optics are worse now. Sometimes it probably still works, honestly, to just retreat and like block people who don't agree with you, or, you know, not hear anything except for, you know, yes men. But like also, you know, I think about like that. I think about bell hooks on the first act of violence that sort of patriarchy demands of men is the, you know, killing off of the part that's vulnerable. So that ability to feel, like we talked about love, sex, and fascism. I think that love in the middle there is like, love is completely predicated on our ability to feel vulnerable and open. I mean, not to get all Brene Brown on us, but it is. You can't love someone else if you aren't capable of taking in vulnerability, like whatever comes, and like maybe it's going to be negativity and you have to work with that. Like love is actually a constant negotiation of another consciousness. And so that's a very vulnerable position to be in. And if you have this sort of incel culture, I think, where like there's this idea about these people who are having all this sex. The sex is very transactional. You know, there's bodies that are optimized for it. Your body's not optimized for it. It's a myth, and you can kind of see how that myth came about through like advertising and media. You know, you can see how they got there. It's just not. It's not necessarily reflected in the reality that is other people. And you know, you end up with this feeling that you were entitled to something, but you didn't get it because you were not optimized in a way that other people are optimized. It's this like weird sickness of like projecting like neoliberal capitalist kind of values onto other relationships with other people and making them transactional.
Right.
And it's very hard for us to stop doing that. It's very hard for us.
It plays right into the idea that it's transactional in that, or that, your esteem, your worth, your own personal value is reliant on the validation of women, and women are the gatekeepers of that validation, right? So it's not just that women are the gatekeepers of sex. They're also the gatekeepers of what's cool. They're also the gatekeepers of what's valid. And so like to be any of those things, those women need to stop, if they're closed off to you, then like, it's something wrong with you, or it's something wrong with the system, right? Or both.
I mean, I think you just kind of described what like red pill ideology is about. There's this, it's all set up so that women can be the arbiters of what's cool, right? That's exactly. That's the thing that like, that they fight against or they resist is that they perceive that to be true, but they think it's unfair. I think everyone feels vulnerable. Everyone feels like they're not, like they're looking into someone's eyes and not being seen as a human being back. I think that's something that, people of all genders feel. But the ways that we've been socialized does tend to, I think, we do tend to project that onto women in our culture.
Yeah, the whole there are alpha men and beta men, and then there are like those losers, the extreme losers of that game that are called incels. It's their ideology I see as just like something that's produced by a broader narrative that's more generally accepted. So a lot of people do buy into a lot of the ideas that kind of produce that extreme, and it just kind of revolves around. I mean, every teenage romance movie almost, it's just like there's that good boy and there's the bad, the bad boy, and the bad boy gets the girls, and the good boy is like in the friend zone, which means that they deserve something that they're not getting, and it's just like this dilemma, and it's just like the whole thing's predicated on this frame that's like garbage. So sometimes
I just want to get on my motorcycle and ride. But no, I think that you're right. I think that I also think a lot about how propaganda and advertising and the Century of the Self, the documentary about Edward Bernays, and how like Freud's theories directly give rise to the culture of advertising and public relations. It's like we do live in a world that we're swimming with this sort of messaging, cultural messaging, even the movies, things we read themselves. And the goal of it isn't to convince us of anything. It's to recondition our perception to be, good consumers or whatever it is. So I like not to like let anyone off the hook, but I do see how if you are a young person growing up and coming of age in the internet, and you're maybe like socially isolated or in a place where you don't really fit in with the people there. I like grew up on a farm in Iowa, and then we moved to Wichita Falls, Texas. And this was like slightly before the internet. When I was like young, we didn't have the internet. It's just like, that is a really lonely place to be. And if the internet offers you a way to sort of band together with other boys with tiki torches or whatever it is and blame someone else, that dynamic we've already established in the 20th century through a really gnarly set of circumstances that works. It gets people to band together against common enemies, and it does not end well, for anyone. In the short term, it doesn't end well for the people you're bounding together against. In the long term, you don't necessarily survive that either. It's not good. It's not good praxis. Fascism is a terrible practice. So, what do we have to do? We have to work on our ability to feel like we're worthy to be vulnerable with another person, which means we have to forgive ourselves for these sins that advertising and media have like heaped on us, and the shortcomings that we perceive in ourselves. We have to like overcome that programming. It's like being raised in a overbearing religious household and deciding, I'm fine. If God is not an asshole, then God doesn't hate me like this, and then getting to the point where you can give other people the same benefit of the doubt you're giving yourself. I do think that, there's some places where it goes off the rails, but I do think that like Wilhelm Reich is right about the individual psychology of fascism as it pertains to the individual and the sort of psychosexual complex that, maybe some of the particulars aren't exactly there, but I do think that is going on. We can see it going on, like I kind of like look at and follow a lot of people who are like making content out of their own loneliness. And, I don't want to, there's always the risk of like platforming or reaching out to the exclusion of other people who are being like obviously, victimized. There's a cover on Esquire magazine this week of like a white boy from Wisconsin who's 17 years old, and everyone's like, this is so insensitive. It's Black History Month. And it is, and it's a terrible article, and the way that it's framed is even worse. The editor is like, I didn't realize Esquire was such a dumb magazine, but it's terrible. There is a conversation that needs to happen. It's not that conversation. It's not the conversation that you're in an echo chamber too. It's like, actually, most of us have, like, a lot of us have grown up in those kinds of places. Like, I grew up in those kinds of places. I just don't live there anymore. And even if you do still live there, you can, you're a very smart person in Boise, Idaho. And I'm sure there are people around you who've like learned from you learning. I'd rather hear about someone who is learning and not someone who is where they started and hasn't questioned anything. I want to hear about that kid in 5 or 10 years if he like manages to get somewhere, or if he's a kid.
My most recent like full-length video, the Mega Hats one, I have that clip from Paul Joseph Watson saying, for the crime of wearing a MAGA hat and smirking, right? And like that's right. If you watch that video in its entirety, which I do not recommend, although I won't be like him. He always says, I watched it so you don't have to. I will say, go for it. But it's just cringy, the whole thing. But he's like the worst on the spectrum at this point, I think. But he says that at the very end of it, he says, like, look, let's be honest. This is about being a white male and being straight, and that these boys, that's what this is ultimately about. And he closes out that video by looking at the camera, being like, "You're okay if you're white. You're okay if you're a male." And it's just like, oh my God. Like the victim complex that he is festering, right, in his audience is so terrifying to me. And I just imagine, coming in to the internet during this kind of a climate, right? For me, it was like MySpace and stuff like that, right? Like I could have very easily been like swept away by something like this, especially like, Amberly Frost. She's affiliated with the Chapo, people. I don't know if she's on the show or not. I'm not a huge fan, but I saw an interview where she's talking about, if you're like a teenage boy and you're getting on the internet, there's two internets, and there's the one where you're already implicated in rape culture and you're already, racist, and the other one you're able to be like, you can be badass and say pretty much anything you want to, and it's edgy, and she's like, yeah, and that's kind of why I feel like I might have been swept away in that other direction, because the people will make it out to be as though like you have like this infinite debt to repay now because of that. And so I don't know any of these people myself. I don't, I'm over here on the far left. I don't see anybody like that, but it's something that the anti-SJW industry likes to cherry pick and stitch together into this straw man that they constantly, use.
I will say that I do see it on the far left, or at least people who think they're far left, people who are like Marxists. You do see it. You absolutely do see anti-PC culture, which PC culture itself being a term that was like fostered and propagated through far right media, controlling the terms of conversation. It's like, there's two internets, one that's only edgy white boys and one that's everyone else. It's like, yes, you have to learn how to live in a world that is not just a safe space for you. Yeah. I mean, the idea of a safe space being so abhorrent is like complete projection, because white masculinity has been a safe space for people who don't, like we were just saying, you don't have to feel the consequences of this woman's displeasure. She shows up to work tomorrow and doesn't have a job because you just had her fired. That's a safe space. And if you can't do that, or if people are like deciding not to help you do that anymore, you have to negotiate the world in other ways. You have to figure out how to be charming, or how to be smart, or have something interesting. Yeah, just like learn a trade, like
right.
Plumbing, you were going to be super useful in the apocalypse, but like figure something out, have a thing that's not just being an edgy dick, and you're actually like, honestly, you're going to be very valuable in a lot of circles, because people, if you're like a ally, if you're like a white person or a white man who can have these conversations and is comfortable having them, you are a hot commodity, my friend, because you can, people will like eventually, once they, realize they can trust you, and you'll have real friends that aren't just like memes and like, people you never meet, or you get to the rally and it's just like 4 guys with Keck flags draped over their helmet. Right. And it's just like those, I mean, that's like, that's like LARPing. That's not real life.
Yeah, I didn't mean that there aren't anti-PC or anti-SJW types on the far left. What I meant was that I don't see a lot of this, you have an infinite like debt to repay merely and you're more of a sinner or something because of the privilege that's been, bestowed on you by systemic racism and sexism and things like that.
I think that there's a pitfall in taking the general or the societal or the structural and making it personal, and this is a pitfall that like we see all over the place, but like we're talking about structural systemic racism and the way that individuals can uphold it. But if we can get on the same page about that, then what can happen is, a system of reparations and, universal basic income, or all of the good things that, the Wolf was talking about. But I think that, politically, there are things that you can do besides self-flagellation and, victim complex to make outcomes more equitable for everyone. And, there are people who you can follow in that regard, and they would love to have straight white men who can talk about these things, and who can go into spaces where it's not necessarily safe for other people to go into, and advocate on behalf of all of us. I think that the obstacle is not necessarily the other people. I feel like the judgment and the shame is coming from inside the house, and getting over that feeling that you are not worthy of love and that you're not, a fully human person is hard. And it's isolating, and it's hard, and it's hard for everyone. It's not. Yeah. And I believe that white men experience it, and I believe that they have a hard time with it because it's hard for everyone. But I feel like, I think you can go so far as to say like creating a welcoming context for folks who are coming away from their more conservative upbringings, or like kind of just coming to ideas. I like the way that your content tends to be really friendly and approachable. But ultimately, people are going to think about you what they're going to think about you regardless. Like I'm going to walk into spaces and be like as nice as I can be, and I'm still going to get people's issues that aren't about me projected on me, you know?
Right.
Like the very first comment on that YouTube video of my talk from the Jordan Peterson conference says, like, starts talking about like how I'm pointing my finger at someone. And I'm just like, okay, so what we're looking at is like, you have a complex about thinking that women are like judging you or the things you're into, women are like gatekeeping what's cool or whatever. And like, this is a thing that is being like, yeah, like I feel I feel like women's fingers. I feel like I want to make a video about fingers. Like if my finger has its size on you, you will know.
There's hundreds of these comments in the Wolf.
Yeah.
Where people are talking about, oh, some dude with a dress. Oh yeah, I can't take this person seriously. They have a bow in their hair, and it's like I bet you're the same people who would probably say that we shouldn't let appearances get in the way of ideas, but you can't take. Well, I wasn't talking about my identity at all in those opening remarks. Like that never came up. But no, I just can't even watch this show. You know, it's just ridiculous.
I mean, yeah, I have like my hair is like is blue, and I feel like that is a thing that like that was a comment. It's just like
the blue-haired feminist.
Yeah, my friend does it. It's cool. It's fine. You can do it if you want it or don't like it. That's fine too. Like I know, like. Yeah. Yeah.
There's also like milk toast liberal normies with dyed hair, and there's also fascists with dyed hair. Dyed hair really doesn't tell you anything at all. So.
I just like color.
Yeah.
It looks nice in the light. Yeah. Anyway, did we get to the bottom of fascism?
I feel like we've gotten just about as far as we're going to get. Let's do a little recapitulating and close it out for if we have any.
Do we have questions from our YouTube viewers?
Yeah, there's a couple here. So, absolutely. So I'm going to read off. The Dangerous Maybe said some of the comments on your videos just go to show how much certain people turn leftists into ideological scapegoats. I don't know if that was to me or you. It seems like it's applicable to both of us. Mm-hmm. In those comments. And River Ransom said, is there a specific terminology for that position where someone is expected to debate their very right to exist? It is such a mindfuck and a no-win situation and a problem that folks have to fight.
That's a good question. I think that there's a great article by Ijoma Loo that I would link to about like, I don't care if you like me, you just have to think I'm human. Like, I feel like she writes like good things on that subject all the time. I don't know if she has a name for it, but like, she's very good at sort of describing how fraught that is to expect and demand that people go through the motions of constantly defending their own existence.
Cool.
And she wrote a book about race called So You Want to Talk About Race that people should read too.
Oh, that one. Yeah, that's in my Audible shopping cart right now, actually. So let's try to, over the next day or so, as I'm editing this up, try to pull together some of the links that we, further reading, further listening, further viewing that people might want to check out when this goes up in its podcast and polished video formats. I don't think it'll be that polished of a video, just some wording. It'll be basically this. For everybody who joined us live, thank you so much for the questions, and it was just cool having a live audience. And Emily, thank you so much for this first conversation. I'm glad we were able to do this. It's helping me sort out several things that I'm trying to like hold together and comprehend. So yeah.
Well, I always love talking to you, and I'm glad that we got to do it face to face instead of just on the phone while you're walking across campus. And
I thought I was going to end up being on phone again, actually, with how this was going at the beginning. But yeah,
I love that you have a green screen and I don't. So hopefully we can just put you in like a replica of my living room.
Oh my God! Could you take a picture of your living room?
Like we're sitting across from each other.
I could invert your living room. Like the colors, invert the colors and put that behind me. All right.
Nice painting. Cool. Right on. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good rest of your evening and a happy Valentine's.
Happy Valentine's Day to everyone. Thanks.
Goodbye.